Welcome, everyone, to Cebu. It is so good to see your faces. I'm Caleb Silver, the editor-in-chief of Investopedia and the president of the board of directors of Cebu. On behalf of the executive committee and the Cebu board, I am delighted to welcome our members, our student members, our sponsors, and our partners to our first in-person event in 2 years. Let's give it up for that. We are back in person. We did it, and seeing you here has already made it worth it, even though we are just getting started. The theme of our conference is the future of business and the economy in the new normal. That's a nod to Muhammad El Arian there. We'd like to extend a special thank you to Dotdash Meredith, the parent company of Investopedia, for hosting us in this beautiful space for the next 2 days. So give it up to Dotdash Meredith. Lovely spot here. Special thanks to our Cebu staff, our executive director, Kathleen Graham, Tess McLaughlin, Tobin Ernst. Thank you for keeping us on track and helping us make this happen, and for all that you do. We'd also like to thank all of our sponsors for helping make this event possible and for sticking with us for the past 2 years. You've always been there for Cebu, and we are so grateful for your support and for your partnership. You can see their names on our posters, you can see them in your program, and on our website. They're all set up outside, and I will name some names later, but thank you for your sponsorship and your partnership. As you can see, there's plenty of space here in the auditorium and throughout our offices, so you can spread out while you hang out with some of the greatest business journalists in the world. We have a terrific program that our conference committee has put together this year. We have newsmakers, newsbreakers, award winners, learning sessions, honorees of our Best in Business Awards, our Distinguished Achievement and President's Award. We have networking sessions. We have a cocktail reception. We have an ice cream social on our outside here. We're going to be hanging out on our lovely deck overlooking the Hudson later today. So this is a real deal in-person jam session event, and we're delighted that you're here with us. We want you tweeting, we want you TikToking, Instagramming, and sharing on your social media platforms of choice throughout the show. So take some selfies with your friends you haven't seen in a while, people you're meeting for the first time, and post about the sessions and get social while you're here. You see it's hashtag Cebu22 and @Cebu. Make sure you're doing that, but please do it with your phones on silent while you're in the auditorium. If you haven't already downloaded our mobile app for the conference, please do. There you're going to find the schedule along with the full bios of all our terrific speakers over the next couple of days and our special guests. All of the sessions will be here in the auditorium, and we'll break for lunch. We have a little bit of ice cream outside here, and then cocktails later this afternoon downstairs on the 4th floor and outside overlooking the Hudson. I'm going to join you all here in the good seats and make way for our first session featuring David Beasley, the executive director of the UN's World Food Program, who will be interviewed by CNN's Matt Egan on how Russia's war in the Ukraine is triggering a global food crisis. Thank you again for being here, and please enjoy the conference.
Thank you for that, Caleb. David, thank you for being here and for taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk to us. Now, you have a unique vantage point into what is happening on the ground in Ukraine during this conflict with Russia. Can you talk to us about how big of a threat this conflict poses to the supply of food globally?
Yeah, it's going to be much worse than you think, actually. They grow enough food. Ukraine farmers grow enough food to feed about 400 million people. That's pretty much going to be out of the equation for the next many, many months. And before Ukraine war, we were already facing a significant crisis. Had already begun meeting with leaders around the world saying that 2022 would be probably the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II for a variety of reasons. Let me back up a little bit and help understand that when I arrived at this job over 5 years ago, there were 80 million people marching to starvation. There were 650 million people chronically hungry. That's different than shock hunger that might be from war or climate extremes, things like that. And so it was 80 million. That number jumped to 135 right before COVID, primarily driven by man-made conflict and climate extremes, climate change, et cetera. So COVID comes along, and because of the economic ripple effect, and the reason this is important because you'll begin to see how fragile the whole system is right now. And so the number, because of economic rippling of COVID in so many dynamic ways, which I'm sure many of you have written about, the number went from 135 to 276 million people. Now, in that 276, there are now 48.7 million of those in 43 countries that are what we call IPC level 4 knocking on famine's door. So if you want to know which country very well could destabilize over the next 12 months, we can lay out those 43 countries for you and then begin to break down each one individually, and then overlay many other dynamics, and then you'll see what we're facing. Now, just when you think it couldn't get any worse, then you have Ethiopia. Then you have Afghanistan. And then the breadbasket of the world, Ukraine. And so what's very problematic about Ukraine is that, yes, they grow enough food to feed 400 million people, but the farmers are primarily on the front lines. Right before the war, the good news was right before the war, they put the planting into the field in the winter for the wheat, the barley, things like this. But the harvesting for that is now July, August. And so even if they harvest, where are they going to put it? Because the silos are full. Why are the silos full? Because the ports aren't operating. And we can get into the weeds of this and talk about impact it has on countries specifically, regions specifically, and it has an impact on us dramatically because we buy 50% of what we buy from Ukraine. Already the expense operational costs for fuel increasing, food increasing pricing, and shipping costs is already a $71 million operational expense on us per month. So let me throw it back to you, Matt.
Okay, so you have this cascading series of events from COVID to now the war, making the situation worse. And you said that 2022 was already shaping up to be a horrible year as far as food supply goes. So, I mean, are we looking at a massive food shortage? How would you describe that situation?
Yeah, you won't have a massive food shortage in 2022. It's a pricing problem. 2023, you're going to have a food shortage problem for a variety of reasons.
Including the war.
Well, compounded by the war and mostly affected by the war for a couple of reasons that most people don't think through. I'm sure y'all have, but the fertilizer situation. Fertilizer pricing is out of the roof, and now the availability of fertilizer. We've got droughts, unprecedented number of droughts in regions around the world, including the United States, in Southwest Texas and places like that, and other droughts around the world. But fertilizer is a heck of an issue. And so we're looking at the possibility of an availability of food problem next year. But regardless, it's the food pricing problem that really becomes, people primarily in the United States will be, some people might buy less Netflix, but you're going to have enough money to buy the food you need. It's going to be tough on people, but nothing compared to in Chad and Niger and Mali and Ethiopia, where if I give you the economic indices and you go look at Arab Spring time frame and look what we have now, it's a lot worse than it was in the Arab Spring time frame.
Yeah, so Arab Spring, obviously there was widespread social unrest then. Do you see the potential for the fact that this year food prices are going up so sharply in countries that are already vulnerable? I mean, is this going to lead to social unrest?
Yeah, you're already seeing protests taking place in Peru, Indonesia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. You already saw destabilizing dynamics in Mali, Chad, Burkina Faso. And a lot of that, if you go back to the Syrian war, a lot of this is based on food pricing. And when people can't feed their children, their families, then the politics unsettles. I mean, you're seeing it happen in the United States, a wealthy nation on inflation, and families at the grocery store buying milk at higher prices, all these things. So you can imagine what the heck you think's happening in like places like Chad and Malawi and DRC and places like that. And here's where it really hits the fan. As Warren Zevon would say, what hits the fan? I mean, it's incredible. We are now cutting back millions and millions to 50% rations or no rations in countries all over the world. So if we're not there with a safety net program, then the political extremists or whatever the case may be exploit that, and next thing you know, you got riots, protests, and then you end up with destabilization, famine, destabilization, and then mass migration by necessity. Whether it's Central America, just FYI, when you feed 125 million people like we do, we survey people all the time. And we usually see things a year or two out before you see it. And I'm always meeting with, as you can imagine, leaders in countries saying you need to get ahead of this thing. Let me tell you what's going to happen in a year. But in Central America, the number of people now talking about migrating is 5 times what it was just 1 year ago. 5 times. So as I met with my Democrat and Republican friends in the Senate and the House in the last 2 days, I said, look, you know, you guys, it's like you got water lines in the ceiling that are leaking and you got to replace the flooring, the carpet, the curtains, the chairs, the table. I said, why don't you, instead of fighting over where to put the buckets, why don't you go fix the leaks? It's a heck of a lot cheaper. The Washington Post, I think there might have been a Post person here, did an article last year that on the border for children's shelters run by HHS, $3,750 per child per week, $60 million a year. So when I talked to my conservative friends, I said, okay, do nothing, and you're going to pay $3,750 per child on the border versus $1 to $2 per week to stabilize the food security situation in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, whatever the case may be. I said, you're going to pay for it one way or the other. Syria, Germany just did a study, $125 billion for 1 million refugees over a 5-year period, $70 a day versus 50 cents a day inside Syria. And guess what? The Syrian, the Guatemalan, they don't want to leave home. They don't want to leave home. But if they don't have food security, they would do what any mom and dad would do. They will find hope for the children. And if you can eliminate migration by necessity, then you're down to the political issue of migration by choice, and that's a different debate. It's much more relaxed, easier discussion.
Let's go back to the situation in Ukraine, because I know you've been to the region multiple times since the war began. Why is it that the crops are not getting out of Ukraine, which you described as the world's breadbasket? Why is that not happening right now?
Yeah, I don't know how many saw the 60-minute production Scott Pelley and I did, and it was a very strategic piece. Scott and I did a hell of a story when the Hadada port was blockaded by the coalition. And we had to unblock that port because people in Yemen would be starving to death, no matter how you felt about the Houthis or whatever, this kind of thing. And I'd been in Yemen many, many, many times. So we were able to unblock the ports by a massive story that moved the American people. And so the same thing here, because the port is critical. You can't truck enough food outside of Ukraine. Let me just give you a little bit of dynamics. In the port of Odessa area, you got 3 or 4 ports there that you move all the food, supplies, and by the way, over 40% of their GDP is from the ports. And so 3,000 on average per day train carloads move through those ports. So the infrastructure for moving that, and each carload of train, that's 3 to 4 truckloads. So do the math. That's 10,000 trucks per day, of which you got to drive 2, 3, 4 days to get to where you want to go, which increases the cost of food supply by 120, give or take, dollars per ton, which makes it then unmarketable. And that would be about probably 50,000 trucks and truck drivers you're going to have, and that just doesn't get realistic, not to get into the logistics of checkpoints and all of those issues. So that port is critical. And as I've said to leaders around the world, if you don't get this port issue resolved and open, Ukraine's economy completely collapses and becomes landlocked, like Moldova. I said, ports are critical. They're absolutely critical. So the world leaders have got to put the pressure on Russia in such a way that we can have neutrality to move supplies in and out of Odessa. It's critical. Now, the farmers primarily are on the front lines. So you've got inputs, pesticides, fertilizers, all that needs to be taking place. Where are you getting the fertilizers from right now? The farmers are primarily on the front line. There is an anticipation they could end up with 50% harvest production. Out of 109,000 metric tons that they produce, 109 million metric tons they produce per year. 40-something of that is consumed internally, and the rest is shipped externally. Now, places like Egypt, there are 26 countries that depend, 50% of their grain comes from Ukraine. So you overlay those 26 countries with the 43 countries and start overlaying other factors, you begin to see this is going to get pretty difficult. Lebanon, 80-something%. Lebanon can't store grain, but a little bit. Why? Remember the Lebanon bomb explosion blew out the silos 2 years ago? So I went down to Odessa, me and Scott Pelley, to kind of give a story focused on the port. And while I was there, they were, missiles were flying overhead and they were bombing bridges. But they haven't, interesting enough, they have not strategically hit port infrastructure.
But they've blocked the port infrastructure.
Oh, yeah. Blocked. It's completely blocked.
So what is your message then to Vladimir Putin when it comes to the port of Odessa and blocking it? I mean, what would you say to him?
That's easy. I'd say what you do to the Ukrainians is one thing, but you go put famine to the rest of the world. Millions of people around the world will die because these ports are being blocked. And if you have any heart at all for the rest of the world, regardless of how you feel about Ukraine, you need to open up those ports. And obviously, Ukrainian military is very concerned if they open up the ports that Russia does a quick move and invades through that port. So there's got to be assurance, and then there's going to have to be, I can't get into this discussion because I'm the humanitarian guy, but there's going to have to be an understanding from international community that they're going to do what's necessary to protect that port from being invaded. But that's not my...
A military understanding.
That's right. That's not my job.
Okay. Now, Germany's vice chancellor today accused Russia of using energy as a weapon.
Yeah.
Do you feel that Russia is weaponizing food?
If we don't open those ports, it's just 2 plus 2 is 4.
What's the timing like? I mean, how obviously?
I think you only got like 60 days.
I'm sorry?
I think you got at most 60 days to get those ports operational.
And if not, what? What happens after the 60 days?
Well, the agricultural economy collapses, and their GDP, I don't see how the country doesn't do anything but collapse. And so once that happens, and if they keep it shut down, how are you going to how do you rejuvenate that economy? Is the West will continue to put billions upon billions of billions for the next 5, 10 years? So it's showtime. I mean, as we say, as to this port. And it's because the farmers harvest in July and August, and the silos primarily are full. This is why I'm trying to bring the world's attention to you only got a matter of days to resolve this issue. Now, we are trying to analyze out, all the silos are not full, but most are, because the ports aren't working, and you got to get the ports working to get the silos empty. How much we can move out by truck is about 1 million something, we meaning the international community, about 1 million metric tons per week, per month. That's just not going to cut it, but it helps. But then that creates a pricing problem. Who's going to buy $122 more per ton, right? I mean, maybe Bezos or Musk will do that. I don't know. But we're looking at what could be some massive short-term storage options that might buy more time, but we're in the early stages of that. We did some of that in Iraq. We're going to see what we could do. But when you start trying to store temporary storage for millions and millions of metric tons, and by the way, India has got massive reserves, and we're negotiating with India to have hopefully a breakthrough, at least on the grains that we need for operational purposes. And we'll end up probably buying for a lot of countries to help them, like Ethiopia, Egypt, Lebanon, things like that. But
a breakthrough in terms of India releasing some of their reserves.
Yeah. And actually, they're talking about potentially selling to us at less than 50% market value. But that's early stages, and that could really take a lot of pressure off us in terms of the fact that we don't have enough money. We're $10 billion short of what we need, and thank God the United States Senate, United States House is responding, and we can get into that.
Well, so you've been in Washington. You've been talking to leaders of both parties. I would imagine talking to people from the administration. Yeah. Is your message? Do you feel like your message is being heard? I mean,
yeah. It was a struggle a few years ago and I used to give a lot of you guys grief about this. You turn on the news and it was like 95% Trump. I don't care if you love or hate the guy, and then Brexit. And I'm like, look, I got people starving to death all over the world. Balance out the news. And I was really struggling to get that messaging into the United States Senate, the House, and at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. But fortunately, because I knew a lot of those men and women that I'd served with, I was able to take advantage of those old relationships at both ends, and we were able to sensitize the U.S. government. And our funding actually went up from $1.8 billion to $3.84 billion until Trump left, for example. And now this year, because the Biden administration and the Ds and the Rs in the Senate, and I spoke to most of the Senate yesterday, the last 2 days, even the conservatives, they get it. I said, look, you know, I know I've done these excessive television shows in Germany because you get, and Germany's funding went from like 300-something million to 1.4 billion. Because why should I send money down to Chad or Niger when I got bridge problems and healthcare problems in Bavaria or Illinois, or, you know, it's the same argument. And I said, well, let me explain why. And let me show you what's going to happen if you don't. If you're not going to do it out of the goodness of your heart, you damn well better do it out of your national security interests. But let me tell you, because you think you had a problem, this is my argument. I remember French 24 television said, she said, tell me about the Sahel. And I said, well, you think Syria was a problem? A nation of 21 million people, had a few million migrate your way with a small infiltration by ISIS, Al-Qaeda. I said, wait till the greater Sahel, from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, that's 500 million people, destabilizes, infiltrated by ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, headed your way. It'll make Syria look like a picnic. She said, you trying to scare the European people? I said, hell yeah, I'm trying to scare you. You need to wake up to the reality, because there are no free lunches. And the conservatives, when you explain it to them that way, they're like, I get it, I get it. Because it's either out of this line item at 1/100th of the cost, or it's out of these line items, military and all these other funding items, at 100 to 1,000 times the cost. So the U.S. Senate, U.S. House, I think we're going to pull out $5 billion for food security because of the Ukrainian crisis. That, assuming we get through all the red tape. And
What red tape?
Oh my gosh, the UN can be something else, and the U.S. can be something else. All the governments can be something else. But that is going to have a massive impact on stabilizing nations, preventing famine, and averting mass migration.
So earlier you mentioned Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, yeah. And I know you're not shy about talking to some of the billionaires, including Elon Musk. What is your message, though, to business leaders around the world and to the billionaires? You know, many of whom read the publications who are represented in this audience. What can they do to help this situation?
And they can do a lot. You know, philanthropy is not going to be the solution to poverty around the world. It helps. There's no question about that. But the private sector is critical. And as I've said to the world's billionaires, is that, look, normally I'm not interested in getting your money in a charitable way, but we have a one-time crisis unlike anything we've ever seen before. And I said, what I really want your engagement in on the long term is solving problems in countries, engaging with us, not charitably, fine, okay, good. But I need for you to engage. You're putting rockets up in space. You got incredible technologies and mindsets. Let's solve the hunger problem for countries around the world. It's doable. Engage with us. Take ownership of countries in terms of trying to resolve these issues. In the meantime, though, because we have this perfect storm, and the billionaires, in the height of COVID, average net worth increase was $5.2 billion per day. Net worth increase. I just need 2 days worth of your net worth increase. Is that too much to ask? I mean, my God, it's not. I can break those numbers down in a whole lot of different ways. And so, you know, Elon, Bezos. Now, it's been interesting to see they're responding in, and as I've said privately, I said, look, I don't care if you give it to me. Give it to somebody. Do something. Engage into the game. And we've seen some movement. Now, we haven't seen anybody step up and say, hey, there's $1 billion yet, but we're still hoping. You know. Right, maybe that'll change. Although the fact the stock market is down as much as it is might not be. Yeah, well, if they'd given it, like I said, 7, 8 months ago, they'd be heroes. Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, I think we want to open it up to take some questions. If anyone in the audience has questions for David.
Hello? Hello. Yeah, thank you so much for your session. My name is Diana Lee. I'm a master's student at NYU's Business Journalism program. I really resonate with this session because I'm from China, and you probably heard about what is happening in the Shanghai lockdown. And a lot of my friends in Shanghai are actually starving. They're developing all kinds of algorithms just snapping up vegetables. It's not really about the food productions problem because the country has very affluent agriculture. So I was wondering, what's your take on the logistics and especially the distribution part of the food that poses such kind of challenges that we're seeing today? Thank you.
Yeah, you know, this is what's critical to understand because we didn't have availability of food problem before the Ukraine, and though we may have in the next year, it's pricing because logistics costs already 4 times shipping costs, fuel costs, all this goes into play. And so like in China, right, China's been buying every bit of grain it can get its hands on. I mean, they own pretty much, I have the numbers, I can't remember off the top of my head. I want to say like 50% of the world's grain reserves right now. They've now got in, this is unofficial, they now have 95% grain reserves, what their consumption capacity would be on an annualized basis. So just think about it. Now, what's really interesting, I know these numbers aren't out, but COVID lockdown, their consumption rate's down 25%. And so when the COVID lockdown's over, so do the math. What's coming? And so there's a lot of little factors out there like that, coupled with all the droughts we're facing with the fertilizers, because a lot of farmers are just not planting or they're cutting back on fertilizers. And then you get the smallholder farmers, because you can imagine if the fertilizer that they can get is out of reach for them because they're poor already. So, because you got to think how many hundreds of millions of smallholder farmers out there in these countries, because most of the countries that we're in, the smallholder farmers grow the food themselves, and we're reaching just a small percentage of that, 125 million, but still it's a small percentage compared to the other 7.6 billion people on Earth. And most of them are in these poor countries. And so this is where those who are not in the humanitarian sphere, what we call classification IPC 3, 4, 5, they go start moving into mass numbers. So we're looking at a 50 million, I gave you the number, 276 million people that are in what we call IPC 3, 4, 5. That's, I say, marching to starvation. The UN talks language that nobody understands. I throw all that garbage in the trash can and talk, common sense. So we're looking at least over the next many months, 50 million more people coming into that category. Pricing, it's going to be all about pricing, logistics, supply chain costs, and what happens in China is going to impact what India does. All these things are very, very relevant. The farming in Brazil, United States, Argentina, France. In fact, I've been talking with the G7 agricultural ministers. How fast can you offset? I would like to be at the end of this year say I was wrong. We're not going to have a food problem, but I'd rather be wrong that way than we're wrong and didn't prepare the other way. Now, what has been interesting is that the Green Party, the Greens in Europe, have really been very responsive and practical, understanding we've got a crisis. Let's be reasonable. Let's find, without backing up, but literally how do we, all these set-aside lands and other things that we can do to put back into productivity to get through this crisis,
Hi, Henry Dubroff, Pacific Coast Business Times. I saw you on 60 Minutes, very impressive. I have a two-part question. First, are there innovations in food storage, grains or X-grains that could allow for a lot speedier shipment, a lot less spoilage? We know there are advanced coatings that are preserving fruits and vegetables without refrigeration. Could technology and innovation be part of this? And then I have a follow-up question related to Russia.
I missed the first part of that question, the first 10 seconds of that question.
Are there innovations in food storage or transportation, particularly X-grains, that could
there was
resolve some of this?
A lot of Chinese people got you had massive, these mega mountains of grain that rotted. I don't know how much of that made the news. I mean, mega mountains. Their advanced technologies and I'm not an expert at this, I just have heard my guys talk about this, that make storage of grains much longer. It's more expensive, of course, but most of the countries don't have that more advanced technology. And the smallholder farmers, as you well know, on grain loss or food waste, 1/3 of all the food produced in the world is wasted. In the developing countries, you know where it is when you go out to dinner, right, here in New York. But in the developing nations, because they don't have storage capacity, this is one of the things that I wanted to focus on big time, because the amount of food that is wasted, other than it has an impact on, carbon footprint, that's wasted water, fertilizers, all that, that could feed 2 billion people right there, 2 billion. So the storage issue is very, very important, short-term and long-term. I'm just not up to speed on that, on what I could give you a deeper answer on that.
And the follow-up question is, are there forces within Russia, people that you talk to, perhaps that you don't want to name names, but people that you talk to who might find a resolution to this Odessa problem, either by having the Egyptians or the Israelis or somebody have access to the port and
Yes.
having Mr. Putin,
Yes.
having Putin stand down?
Yes, sir. We're definitely on the phone, and not to get into too much of the weeds there, a little sensitive, but I've been talking to a lot of leaders in several countries about maximizing that pressure. Private sector relationships that go inside the Kremlin, and I've talked to several of those, and everybody's engaging. African countries that have a relationship with the Kremlin, who are going to be in serious trouble if these ports aren't open. The pressure that they need to understand. So this is an opportunity for particularly Europeans in the United States to talk to the leaders in these countries. I think a cumulative effect. I don't think it's going to be one or two calls. I think it's going to be a cumulative effect. I still think that every human being's got some goodness in them. So I always like to appeal to that, and we'll keep the pressure moving, and let's hope. I have reason for hope, but then again, I've been disappointed before,
Thank you for joining us today. James Bador with Newsday. Can you talk about the role of American agriculture in trying to avert famine in 2023? We're halfway through 2022. What can American agriculture do to help solve this problem?
Yeah, Tom Vilsack, we've already talked, and what can the American, when you go back to the history of the World Food Program and go back to Eisenhower and President Kennedy, the World Food Program, and using food for peace, surplus grains from the United States to help the starving people around the world. I mean, what a remarkable display of American kindness. And the farming community and the American taxpayer all stepped up over the past 50 some odd years, 60 years. And so here we are today. When you look at our, let's say last year, $10 billion budget, 40% of that comes from the United States. Now, historically, that was primarily grain. Today, we've diversified that portfolio from the American taxpayer or the American people. We do now $2 billion in cash-based transfers. And there's a reason for that, because we want to put liquidity into the marketplace. Like in Ukraine, we want to get grain, food to the eastern part, because you don't have a supply chain. But in the western part of Ukraine, you still have supply chain systems that are operating a little bit bumpy. And so we're putting liquidity into that because they need liquidity into the marketplace. So we're trying to maximize purchases that we buy inside Ukraine and giving out cash-based transfers. We'll actually start, I think, next week with 500,000 cash-based transfers, $75 per person for a 3-month period, for a month, so to speak. So we'll get a lot of liquidity in. Now, back to the American farmer, out of that $3.84 billion, gosh, I can't remember how much of that is actual food itself. It's a vast percentage of it. And so what can we do in the United States, because we've got our own grain reserves, right? That's we, meaning the United States, not WFP. And you got in the Southwest a drought taking place right now. You got farmers struggling with the fertilizer costing issue. And so, as I was talking to Tom Vilsack and the other G7 ministers of agriculture, how do you maximize production? But the United States, which is the most generous of all nations on earth by far, no ifs and ors about that. But I'm trying to get France to step up more. At least if they can grow more, take the pressure off of the international market for their own consumption, all these factors come into play, because shipping costs, logistics, supply chain is what's going to be devastating over the next 24 months. I tweeted something out the other day, and somebody said, oh, there's a food surplus. And I'm like, it's a pricing problem. You need to understand with the fuel cost and the shipping cost, and when you start shipping food from Portland, Oregon, all the way to Yemen, versus if we can buy it, from Ukraine at a lot less, that means I can feed more people, right? And so because the problems are so high, the numbers are going so high in terms of people in great need of food, we need everything we can get our hands on right now, commercially and privately, and humanitarian-wise, because you still got to remember there's 7.7 some odd billion people on Earth. We're only feeding 125 million of them. This year we'll scale up to about 150 million, most likely, and hopefully Ukraine will, anyway, that's going to be here for a while unless something happens dramatically.
Okay, I think that's all we have time for, but thank you.
I hope that was informative.
It was very informative, and hopefully it draws some attention to what is an absolutely critical issue.
They're being very respectful, because I got to catch a plane and go to my daughter's wedding, and I know if we have a saying down where I'm from in the South, if mama's not happy, nobody's happy, and the last thing I'm going to do is be late for my daughter's thing. So thank you all for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Governor. David Beasley, the Executive Director of the UN's World Food Program. Matt Egan from CNN, thanks so much. Great panel. Thank you for being here. Congratulations to you and your family and your daughter, of course. Please make your plane. We don't want to be the ones responsible for that.
Thanks, Caleb.
That was incredible. I could have kept listening to that for a long time, but we appreciate David Beasley, the former governor of South Carolina, the head of the UN World Food Program. SABU would like to thank our sponsors for SABU 2022, for their generosity. We could not do this without their support. And as I said earlier, they stuck with us this whole time throughout the pandemic. We've been virtual. We've been doing these conferences via Zoom and otherwise, and they've been with us the whole time, and we have some new sponsors, but I'm going to thank them all in alphabetical order. They're all set up outside, many of them, so please stop by and say hello. Arzent, the Associated Press, Berlin Media Relations, Bloomberg, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Business Wire, CNBC, Dotdash Meredith, again, thank you for hosting us here in your beautiful home, Dow Jones News Fund, Investopedia, the Missouri School of Journalism, the National Endowment for Financial Education, NEFI, a longtime partner of ours, National Public Radio, Northwestern University Medill School of Journalism, Media Integrated Marketing Communications, T. Rowe Price, the Commonwealth Fund, also been with us for such a long time, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and am I missing anybody from this list because they are so important to us? I believe I have them all, but thank you again for your partnership and for your support. We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back and have an incredible panel on cryptocurrency with some of the top reporters who are covering that sector. So in about 15 minutes, we'll see you right back in this room, freshen up, and we'll see you back here at 12:15.